How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Set 6, and today we're going to be talking about the story of Final Fantasy XVI, my thoughts about the story of Final Fantasy XVI, a few questions that kind of require answers, maybe. You know, some stuff that we didn't quite get that we probably want. But yeah, it's just going to be kind of a casual chat about the story of Final Fantasy XVI. So, if you've not finished Final Fantasy XVI, I would probably click off this video because it is going to be full of spoilers. Like, absolutely full of spoilers. So, yeah, use your best judgment on what you do with this video. But that's the spoiler warning out of the way. We're going to get on with it. Don't forget, drop a like on the video, subscribe for future content, you know, do all the things, all of the things. And let me know what you thought about the story of Final Fantasy XVI as well. Get down in the comments and tell me what your thoughts are. Because, you know, this is a community thing. We're all going to have different thoughts and opinions on the story of Final Fantasy XVI. So, you know, get yourself in the comments, share your feelings, share your thoughts. But let's get on with it. So, as a general starting point, the main story of Final Fantasy XVI is not a bad story. It's not a great, god-tier, phenomenal Final Fantasy story in my opinion. But it's not bad. I've seen a lot of opinions floating around, like from people who got review copies of the game, where they said that the story was really good, and then it completely fell off in like the final third of the game. And I would not agree with that. I don't think the story particularly falls off. Maybe it dips a little bit in some ways, but in other ways it elevates itself. So in general, I would say that it probably maintains a pretty solid level throughout the game. I don't think there's a particularly weak section of the actual main story. But one thing Final Fantasy XVI does really well, in my opinion, is it becomes a vehicle for the characters' stories and their own struggles and things like that. And when we get to explore some of the specific stories that characters have, some of their backstories, some of their motivations in life and things like that, that's probably where Final Fantasy XVI is at its narrative best for me. I did quite enjoy the earlier phases of the game where the focus was more on the politics of Valistea and things like that. It never really dug down massively into that concept, and it kind of remained pretty surface level with it, which makes sense given that the story kind of pivots on a different trajectory once we get Ultima coming out, and it kind of becomes more about the survival of humanity in general rather than one specific nation surviving. So yeah, it does take the shine off the political intrigue of Final Fantasy XVI. So I do kind of get where some people come from with that opinion. But you know, let's be real, if you're a newcomer to Final Fantasy, you might think that. But if you've got any kind of experience with Final Fantasy, we've seen this before. You know, where a story kind of goes one way and then pivots hard to another direction. So this isn't new to the bulk of us. This is something that we've seen before in other Final Fantasy games, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, once Ultima is revealed to us, it does kind of come out of left field a little bit. He kind of comes out of nowhere. He's not foreshadowed or anything like that, which, you know, makes sense. You're quite early in the game still at the point where you encounter him for the first time, and it doesn't really get fleshed out that much until right at the very end of the game. So he kind of is very similar to a lot of times in previous Final Fantasies where, you know, you get to the very end of the game and a random boss comes out of nowhere like a Necron or something like that. It's very much similar to that, except we knew he was coming from early on. That's the only difference, really. Because everything that goes on beyond that point, we're still interacting with people in Valistea. We're not really in any kind of confrontation with Ultima at that point. We're dealing with the people that he's manipulated and put in our path, or the people that just generally worship him, which is, you know, Barnabas, essentially. It is pretty much just Barnabas. Barnabas has just got a massive hard-on for Ultima, it would seem. But beyond that, everything that's done, you can see, is influenced by Barnabas, which is influenced by Ultima. So you can see Ultima's control over the world of Valistea, you can see the threads of influence from Ultima, and you can see the path that Clive is being led on, which is to gather up all of the dominants and gather all of their essences within this one vessel, this mythos, which we'll come back to, and to destroy the mother crystals, which, again, we'll come back to. But before we get into like the latter stages of the game and things like that, one of the best parts of Final Fantasy XVI is when it explores the shackles that bind the characters in the story. Whether they're self-imposed shackles or whether they're imposed by others. That's when Final Fantasy XVI's narrative is at its best, in my opinion. Such as Clive kind of being forced into this situation initially of being a shield for his brother, then being forced into literal servitude and slavery, and then being kind of thrust into a situation where he is the only person who has the power to do the things that need to be done. You've got Jill, she's literally enslaved by the Iron Kingdom. You've got bearers in general who are literally enslaved by everybody, it's awful. But then you've also got everybody in general who are enslaved by a dependence on magic. So everybody's got these shackles that bind them, and we see them fall away from people gradually as the game progresses. And like I was saying, some of the best narrative moments come when we see these characters supporting each other through these times where not necessarily just casting off the shackles that bind them, but how to exist after. And I think that is literally when Final Fantasy XVI is at its best. This is peak Final Fantasy XVI for me, when we're exploring some of that stuff. It does go a little bit too far with some of its messaging for me at certain points in the game. For example, the very early side quests in the game heavily focus on bearers and the suffering that they go through in general. And I just feel like there was too many of those side quests. I feel like you could probably, if you took all of the bearer-related side quests and probably chopped half of them off, got rid of the rubbish ones, like, I don't know, you know, serving people food in the hideaway, like that could have just been a cutscene. That could have just been a really quick cutscene where, you know, the barkeep shouts Clive over, is like, can you give me an hand here real quick, mate? I just need you to throw these dishes out to these people. And we see a cutscene of Clive doing it and talking to people. You don't need to put me in control of that. You don't need to frame it as a side quest. It shouldn't have been. You get rid of a lot of those side quests, and I think you probably improve the impact of the remaining side quests, because when people are bombarded by a wall of side quests that they don't particularly enjoy, and we'll get into that in a minute, but when people are bombarded by that, it makes you less receptive to the good side quests. Even if you might think, oh, finally a good side quest, I'm into this, you're still a bit drained and a bit fatigued by all of the previous nonsense. So yeah, I genuinely feel like if we probably chopped about half of Final Fantasy XVI side quests out, the remaining ones with no alterations whatsoever would shine far brighter. And I think it would just benefit the game overall. But yeah, that's me. Let me know what you think about that. Do you think that there were too many side quests, or do you think it was about right? Let me know. But yeah, getting back to the connections between the characters, like we see Clive getting rebuilt by his connections with others, and vice versa. You know, you see Clive helping people rebuild themselves as well. You see people in general, communities coming together, all the various locations that we help out across Valisthea. You know, we see all of those locations come together, we see people grow, we see people become more accepting of bearers gradually and things like that. This is, like I was saying earlier, this is where Final Fantasy XVI is at its best in these stories. Once you get to the latter stages of the side quests as well, so, like, you know the point that I mean, you get to the very end of the game, you've literally got the option of go and finish the game or do these side quests. And you kind of get hit with a wall of probably about 14 side quests. The bulk of those side quests are brilliant. Some of them are a bit tepid, and I'm talking narratively here as well. Just narratively. We'll come to gameplay in a minute, but just narratively, they're brilliant, and they expand so much on certain characters. Like, some of the shining examples of this involve Joshua and Torgal. Like, Joshua and Torgal side quests are just so good for what they give you narrative-wise, emotionally, lore-wise. They just give so much. But one of the biggest negatives to the narrative of these side quests isn't even a narrative aspect, and it's the gameplay. It genuinely is the gameplay, and I would expand that out beyond the side quest, and I'd expand it into the main story as well. And also, I'm not even talking about the combat here. Like, we all know that I have issues with the combat, especially if you've watched my review video. If you've not watched it, go watch that one. I kind of break down more of the mechanical aspects of the game and the RPG elements. RPG elements, never mind. But yeah, I look into the game in a bit more depth rather than just the narrative, so go check that one out if you haven't. But when we're talking about the narrative, the biggest aspect that hurts the narrative, in my opinion, is these massive drawn-out gaps between story beats, because every time that you have a major story beat, you are hit by an almost insurmountable wall of side quests. And that hurts the narrative a lot, in my opinion. In the same way that I feel that pacing affects Final Fantasy XIV in a negative way, because you have these big story beats, but you have massive gaping chasms of boring fetch quests in between them. And like I was saying earlier on, you're not going to benefit from the good side quests as much as you would do, because you've been fatigued by all this other stuff. And I feel like that relates to the story as well, the main narrative. I feel like the main narrative almost feels a little bit disconnected at certain points, like the whole Ultima thing. Like, I feel quite disconnected from it for massive chunks of the game. And that's potentially intentional, you know, to keep me focused on the characters and the world and things like that. But then when I get to Ultima, because I've been so disconnected from it for so long, because these walls of side quests add up and contribute massively to the playtime of Final Fantasy XVI. They're probably not the biggest constituent, although actually maybe they are. I think the side quests may actually be the biggest constituent of this game. So imagine if you were to, say, cut them in half, like I've suggested earlier, you would end up with a much snappier, a much more focused game. And I think that that in general would benefit A, the narrative, and B, the side narratives and the character narratives and things like that you get. It's just a kind of, for me, it genuinely felt like the game beat me into submission with banal tasks quite a bit. And I feel like that definitely hindered my enjoyment of the narrative. Let me know what you think about that. But anyway, let's get back to the main story stuff. So, Ultima, like I've said, I've struggled to connect with Ultima as an antagonist. It was quite uninspiring in general. It's very much a similar Ultima to the one that we see in Final Fantasy Tactics, where the motive is about acquiring a host or a vessel, and that's kind of the deal with this Ultima. But I struggled to particularly care about him as a threat. Like, if you stand Ultima alongside antagonists like Sephiroth and Kefka, nowhere near. Even if you stand him up alongside someone like Ardyn from Final Fantasy XV, I don't think he comes close, I don't think he compares. And I don't necessarily think Ultima was a primary focus of this game. I think the game did focus more on the characters and the interpersonal relationships between the characters and the experiences of the characters and things like that. So it kind of made sense that Ultima wasn't that big. But again, like I say, it did leave me feeling a bit, Ultima, okay. That was kind of how it left me feeling. He was much more of a manipulator in the background. Very similar in my mind to when, like, in the older Final Fantasies, a random god would drop in, like I said earlier, and take the place of the guy that we've been fighting all along, you know, like a Necron or something like that. Except this time we knew he was going to be there. We knew that this was coming. And that has been a complaint of people in the past, like, oh, who's this random guy just dropping in and doing stuff? So it kind of made sense that they would expose us to him a little bit earlier. But then I feel like they needed to do more with the mystery around Ultima. Because, like I say, every time we'd get a little bit of mystery about Ultima, it was kind of beaten out of us with banal tasks, and yeah. That was my take on it, at least. Ultima just kind of felt a bit flat. Definitely felt a bit flat. Now, the long-term plan of Ultima was to create humanity and wait for a mythos to be born, a vessel that could handle the amount of power that was required to cast a spell that would create a new home for the gods, that would purify the world, but would also damn humanity at the same time. And it means that the fate that we're struggling against in the game isn't exactly a fated outcome. It's just kind of the long-term plan of some freaky god scientist who his people messed up. They used magic too much, they incurred the blight, and in their efforts to escape the blight, they created a race that pretty much did the exact same things that they did. And this was because Ultima was negligent in shepherding humanity properly, and it brought about a world where people made, like I say, the exact same mistakes. They used magic, they became dependent on magic. I would say that they became incapable of surviving without magic. And that's something that was kind of shown to us repeatedly, that once the crystals started losing their power, people were just kind of like, what do I do? What do we do? How do we do this? What? Everyone was just very confused and lost. And this is where characters leaning on each other, communities coming together and helping and supporting each other. This is where those aspects of Final Fantasy's narratives really got to shine, in my opinion. I enjoyed it. As a narrative, it works overall. And it leaves me with the feeling that Ultima never really was the true bad guy. I mean, he was pulling strings in the background. But I think the true bad guy was this lust for power. and this lack of consideration for the environment and our surroundings and humanity's dependence on magic, and it's obviously a correlation for humanity's dependence on technology today. You can see where humanity is its own bad guy in this game. And in the same sense, Ultima was Ultima's own bad guy. Like, both humanity and Ultima were both fighting against the same thing, that avarice, that greed, that lust for power, that lust for control. And that leads us to the final part of Final Fantasy XVI, where we see Clive destroy that legacy of magic and that legacy of the Mother Crystals, and kind of destroy Ultima and kind of go a different path to Ultima. Like, Ultima thought, right, no, right, we've used magic, right, and it's messed everything up, but we can use magic to fix it. That was kind of the route that Ultima went, whereas Clive's kind of gone the route of, no, we need to stop this, we need to break this cycle, and that's the only way that humanity has got a chance. And we see Clive do that, and yeah, it works. As a narrative, it works. I genuinely, like I say, I'm a bit nonplussed by these people that say the narrative falls off a cliff in the back end of the game. It maybe diminishes a little bit, but I would say in general this is a good Final Fantasy narrative. It's not the best. It's definitely not the worst, though. It's nowhere near the worst. As a narrative, it's quite well done. Final Fantasy XVI is just held back by other aspects, and it's the gameplay. That is the thing that holds back the narrative and reduces the impact of Final Fantasy XVI for me. But it does leave us also in a spot with a few unanswered questions, which is why I believe that we're probably going to get some sort of DLC for Final Fantasy XVI at some point. Now, a lot of the questions kind of stems from the post-credit scene, where we see kind of a few hundred years in the future, we see a couple of kids playing around, they've got a little faithful dog. It looks very reminiscent of Clive, Joshua and Torgal when they were younger. The mother's working away on dinner in the background, and we can see that magic is no longer a thing. People are having to start fires manually themselves. They're having to know how to do that. With magic and the icons and everything like that seemingly being pushed back into fairy tale levels of mythology. Like, that's kind of where it's at now. And we do see a shot at the very end of it of a book called Final Fantasy, written by Joshua Rossfield. And yeah, lots of questions from this point onwards. So, I mean, the first one is, did Joshua die? Because we don't see Joshua get out of Origin, I don't think. Like, we see Clive try to revive him, but we don't see him get out of there, and everything kind of crumbles and falls apart and, gets destroyed. So, kind of a question as to whether Joshua survived. Now, we have seen Joshua survive some pretty big stuff throughout Final Fantasy XVI, but if all magic has left the world, he may no longer have the power of the Phoenix, and therefore probably doesn't survive, would be my guess. On top of that, we've got the question of, did Clive die? Because, we see him on the beach at the end, we see him try to use some of his magic, and only his fingertips have been turned to stone, petrified. But then after he tries to use the magic, we see his hand petrifies very quickly. So it's not looking good for Clive, but again, we don't specifically see him die, so that's a bit sus. That kind of leaves things open. Maybe, as we've seen throughout the game, people do take a long time to petrify, and it relies on them continually using magic. If magic's gone, then he can't continually use magic, so maybe he can just lose his hand and survive? I don't know. I don't know about that. It all kind of depends on the state of magic. Magic as a something that people can just grab a crystal and use, that's gone. But, the bearers and the dominants, would they still be able to maybe use some degree of magic? I mean, we won't see new bearers or new dominants, I would say, but maybe there are some threads of magic that are still hanging on. Maybe on the outer continent there's still an abundance of ether and magic, which would then leave things open. It all depends. It all depends. We don't get any final answers, but we do get some suggestions that say Joshua's potentially dead, Clive's potentially dead, and magic is gone. They're the three kind of hints that we get. But then that book kind of flies in the face of that a little bit. And, if you've done the side quest with Harpocrates, you know that Clive has been encouraged to, pick up a pen and write his story one day. But we also know that Clive is not against taking people's names. You know what I mean? How many names does Clive have throughout the duration of Final Fantasy XVI? He has quite a few. So, yeah, I'm not going to rule it out. I'm not going to rule it out. You can't say either way, I don't think. I don't think you can conclusively say either way. I think the one thing that you can probably be certain of is that magic is mostly gone. Like, maybe the bearers and dominants can still do little bits here and there, but magic as a commodity is gone. That's what I'd say. And then the final question is, where was Leviathan? Like, I've done a video about this. I've done another video just speculating generally about the DLC potential of Final Fantasy XVI, and there is a fair bit of it. There's things I didn't even mention in that video. There's a lot of potential for DLC for Final Fantasy XVI, just maybe not necessarily a post-game DLC, but again, I wouldn't rule it out. Like I say, things are a little bit ambiguous around the final state of Valistea at the end of Final Fantasy XVI. We could definitely do with a bit more information. But yeah, that's my take on the story of Final Fantasy XVI. There are probably bits I've forgotten and not put in there, so you might see future videos where I dive into some of the subjects that I may have forgotten. But in general, I would say that Final Fantasy XVI has a good story with great characters and great character interactions, but it's inevitably hampered by a lackluster antagonist who I don't really feel that much of a connection or a threat from or anything like that, as well as bad pacing, which is the bane of any story. If the pacing's bad, it can kill it. And tedious gameplay, which contributes to the bad pacing. And it's a shame. It genuinely is a shame. But yeah, the story of Final Fantasy XVI, reasonably solid, across the board, with great characters and great character interactions. That's my take on it. What about you though? Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Hit like, subscribe to the channel because there's plenty more content coming. But more importantly than any of that, have a great day.